What happens when a man who's sworn off violence meets the woman who could make him break every promise he's ever made? In the mining town of Moonridge, Montana, some secrets are buried deeper than silver veins, and some promises are worth breaking. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow this incredible journey of second chances, buried truths, and the kind of love that can heal even the deepest wounds. The hammer fell with the rhythm of a broken heart. Strike. Pause. Strike. Pause. Nathaniel Mackenzie worked the red-hot metal on his anvil, each blow precise and measured like everything else in his carefully controlled life. Sparks flew in the dim light of his forge, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with tools he'd crafted, but would never use for their intended purpose. Outside his workshop, the mining town of Moonridge huddled against the Montana winter like a wounded animal. Snow fell in thick, silent curtains, muffling the sounds of a community slowly dying. The silver mine that had built this place was failing, taking dreams and families with it into the dark. Nate paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the December cold that seeped through every crack in the building. His hands, scarred from years at the forge, steady from years on the draw, trembled slightly as he set down his hammer. 4 years. 4 years since he'd sworn off making anything that could take a life. 4 years since Rose had died in their bedroom while he'd been 3 towns over delivering a custom rifle to a rancher who'd paid good money for Nate's deadly craftsmanship. Papa? The small voice made him turn. Daniel stood in the doorway, connecting the forge to their living quarters, all 9 years of him swimming in one of Rose's old shawls. The boy's dark hair, so like his mother's, fell across eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Hey there, partner. Nate's voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat, set down the piece he'd been working a horseshoe, nothing more dangerous than that, and knelt to Daniel's level. Bad dream again. Daniel nodded, then pointed toward the front window. Snow was coming down harder now, and through it Nate could make out a lone figure on horseback, picking their way carefully down the treacherous mountain path that served as Moonridge's main connection to the outside world. Stranger coming, Daniel whispered. His voice was barely audible, the way it had been since the day they'd buried his mother. Before that terrible morning, Daniel had been a chatterbox, filling their small house with laughter and endless questions. Now words seemed to cost him something precious, and he hoarded them like gold. Nate moved to the window, instinctively positioning himself between his son and whoever was approaching. Old habits from his Iron Thunder days died hard, even when he was trying his damnedest to bury them. The rider was small, a woman he realized, though she sat her horse with the confidence of someone used to rough country. She wore practical traveling clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the snow, but something about the way she carried herself tugged at his memory like a half-remembered song. Probably just passing through, Nate said, though visitors to Moonridge had become rare as honest politicians. Most folks with sense had moved on when the mine started having accidents and the miners started getting sick. The ones who remained did so out of stubbornness, poverty, or hope, sometimes all three. The woman dismounted in front of Pete Sullivan's saloon, the closest thing Moonridge had to a hotel these days, and Nate found himself studying her movements. There was something familiar in the way she moved, careful but confident, like she knew exactly where she was going, even in a strange place. Papa, Daniel tugged at his sleeve. Do you know her? It was an odd question from a boy who rarely spoke, and Nate looked down at his son with surprise. Daniel had always been intuitive, even before grief had stolen most of his words. Rose used to say the boy could read people like they were open to books. No, son, I don't think so. But even as he said it, Nate felt the lie settling uncomfortably in his chest. Because there was something about the woman, something that made his heart skip in a way it hadn't since Rose died. Daniel pressed closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. She smells like iron and lavender, he said softly. Nate blinked. What? When the wind changes, she smells like iron and lavender. Daniel's voice was so quiet, Nate had to strain to hear it. Like someone who knows about fixing things that are broken. The observation was strange enough that Nate looked more carefully at the woman. She was talking to Pete now, gesturing toward the mine entrance, visible on the mountainside above town. Her posture suggested she was asking questions, lots of them, the kind that made folks uncomfortable in a place like Moonridge. Probably a government inspector, Nate muttered, or maybe a reporter writing about dying mining towns. But his instincts, honed by years of reading dangerous situations, told him she was neither. This woman had come to Moonridge for a specific purpose, and something deep in his gut warned him that her arrival was going to change everything. "We should go introduce ourselves," Daniel said, and the fact that he'd strung together that many words made Nate look at him sharply. "Why?" "Because," Daniel said, still staring out the window, "she's been looking for us for a very long time." Before Nate could ask what the hell that meant, Daniel had slipped away from the window and disappeared back into their living quarters. Nate stood alone in the forge watching the strange woman disappear into Pete's saloon and wondered why his son's words had sent ice water through his veins. Outside, the snow kept falling, and Moonridge settled deeper into winter's grip. But inside his workshop, surrounded by the tools of creation rather than destruction, Nathaniel Mackenzie felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was buried with his wife. Change was coming to their quiet, dying town. And despite his best efforts to build a life of predictable routine, Nate found himself almost eager to see what form it would take. The woman who called herself Evelyn Sterling checked into Pete Sullivan's saloon with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before in towns just like Moonridge all across the American West. She signed the register in neat, precise handwriting and paid for a week in advance without haggling over the price, a sure sign she wasn't from around here where every penny was counted twice before being spent. "Mining business?" Pete asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Something like that." Eve's voice carried just a hint of an accent educated Eastern, but with something warmer underneath. "I'm here about the accidents." Pete's weathered face darkened. "Ain't no accidents about it. Mine's just played out, that's all. Happens to every vein eventually." "Maybe." Eve pulled off her hat, revealing auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun and green eyes that missed nothing. "But I've seen the reports. Cave-ins don't usually follow such specific patterns, and healthy miners don't develop lung problems overnight. You some kind of expert?" "I'm a mining engineer from Denver." She handed him a card that looked official enough. "The Territorial Mining Commission asked me to investigate." It was only partly true. The commission hadn't asked, she'd volunteered after spending months tracking reports of mysterious mine failures across Montana and Wyoming. Reports that had led her finally to this remote mountain town where she'd known somehow she would find what she'd been looking for. Or rather, who she'd been looking for. "Well, you can investigate all you want," Pete said, "but ain't much left to see. Most of the good families have moved on. Only stubborn fools like me left, and we ain't exactly cooperative with government types." "I understand." Eve tucked the registration card away and shouldered her travel bag. "I don't suppose you could point me toward the local blacksmith. I may need some tools repaired." Pete's expression shifted slightly, surprise maybe, or recognition. "Nate Mackenzie's got the forge on the other side of Main Street, but he don't make what he used to. Shoes horses and fixes plows these days. Nothing more exciting than that." "That's exactly what I need." As Eve climbed the narrow stairs to her rented room, she felt Pete's eyes following her. She'd expected suspicion. Small towns were always wary of outsiders, especially the official-looking ones. But there had been something else in his expression when she'd mentioned the blacksmith, something that suggested Nathaniel Mackenzie was more than just the local ironworker. Her room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over Moonridge's main street toward a building with smoke rising from its chimney. The forge, she presumed. And somewhere inside that building was the man she'd spent the last 15 years trying to find. The man who'd saved her life when she was 10 years old and called herself Annie Murphy. The man who probably didn't remember a scared little girl at St. Catherine's Orphanage who'd promised to come back for her when he'd aged out of the system at 18. The man who'd kept that promise in ways he never knew because she'd made sure of it. Eve unpacked methodically, laying out the tools of her trade: geological surveys, mining reports, chemical analysis equipment that most people in 1887 wouldn't recognize. But buried at the bottom of her travel bag, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that had nothing to do with mining engineering. A small wooden horse carved with the careful attention to detail that only a young man desperate to comfort a crying child could manage. She'd kept it through everything: the adoption by the wealthy Sterling family in Denver, the years of education that had given her the skills to find him, the careful building of a reputation that would let her go anywhere she needed to go. She set the horse on the windowsill where she could see it, where it could remind her why she was here. Outside, snow continued to fall on Moonridge, And somewhere in the building across the street, the man she'd loved since she was 10 years old was probably wondering who the stranger in town might be. Tomorrow she would find out if Nathaniel Mackenzie was everything she'd spent half her life believing him to be. Tonight she would try to sleep in a town that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the careful silence that had settled over it like a shroud. But first she would stand at her window and watch smoke rise from his forge, and remember what it felt like to believe that someone somewhere would always come back for her, even if she'd had to be the one to do the coming back. Dawn came gray and cold to Moonridge, bringing with it the kind of brittle silence that made every sound seem amplified. Nate was already at his forge when the knock came, three precise raps that somehow managed to convey both politeness and determination. He set down the horseshoe he'd been shaping and glanced toward the living quarters. Daniel was still asleep, or at least pretending to be, which meant Nate would have to handle whatever this was alone. The woman from yesterday stood on his doorstep, and seeing her up close made his breath catch in his throat. She was smaller than she'd appeared on horseback, maybe 5.5 feet, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who thought they knew better. Her green eyes studied him with the same careful attention he'd seen her give to Pete Sullivan's saloon, and Nate found himself being cataloged, assessed, and filed away for future reference. "Mr. Mackenzie." Her voice was warm honey over steel. "I'm Evelyn Sterling. I understand you're the local metalworker." "That's right." Nate wiped his hands on his leather apron, suddenly conscious of the soot stains and the smell of coal smoke that probably clung to him. "What can I do for you, Miss Sterling?" "I need some equipment modifications." She held up a canvas bag that clinked softly with the sound of metal on metal. "Mining tools. Nothing fancy, just some adjustments for the specific conditions I'll be working in." "You're the engineer Pete mentioned." "I am." She stepped closer, and Nate caught a scent that made something deep in his memory stir. Iron and lavender, just like Daniel had said. "May I come in? This might take some explaining." Against his better judgment, Nate stepped aside and let her enter his workshop. She moved through the space like she was taking inventory, noting the tools, the layout, the careful organization that spoke of a craftsman who took pride in his work. "You keep a clean forge," she said, approval in her voice. "Not everyone does. Hard to do good work in chaos." The words came automatically, something Rose used to tease him about. His wife had been beautifully, creatively chaotic, and their house had shown it. Only his workshop had been kept in perfect order, a habit from his Iron Thunder days, when a misplaced tool could mean the difference between life and death. Eve set her bag on his workbench and began pulling out instruments that Nate didn't recognize. Precision-made devices with calibrated dials and delicate mechanisms that spoke of Eastern factories and serious money. "Core sampling equipment," she explained, catching his curious look, "for analyzing rock and soil composition. The problem is they're designed for normal mining conditions. What I need to do in your mine is, well, let's say it's not normal." "Our mine's been closed for 3 weeks," Nate said carefully. "Cave-in blocked the main shaft." "I know." Eve's fingers moved over her equipment with the familiarity of long practice. "That's why I'm here. Cave-ins like that don't just happen, especially not in a mine that's been stable for 15 years. Nate found himself studying her profile as she worked. There was something about the line of her jaw, the way she concentrated with her tongue, just touching her lower lip, that felt familiar in a way that made his chest tight. "You think someone caused it?" "I think someone's been causing a lot of things." She looked up at him, and for a moment something flickered in her green eyes. Recognition, maybe, or hope. "Mr. Mackenzie, how well do you know the people in this town?" "Well enough. Been here 6 years, since just after Daniel was born." And before that, the question was casual, but Nate's instincts told him it wasn't. This woman was fishing for something specific, and he'd learned the hard way that specific questions usually led to specific kinds of trouble. "Before that, I traveled some. Did work where I could find it." "What kind of work?" Now he was sure she was leading somewhere. Nate straightened, letting some of his old wariness show. The kind that paid well and didn't ask too many questions. "Why?" Instead of answering, Eve reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on his workbench, revealing what looked like a technical drawing, cross-sections of mining tunnels, structural analyses, depth measurements. This is a survey of your mine from last month, she said. Notice anything unusual? Nate studied the diagram. He wasn't an engineer, but he'd spent enough time in rough country to understand basic structural principles. The cave-in happened in the strongest part of the tunnel system. Exactly. And these, she pointed to several smaller notations, are trace mineral analyses from rock samples, specifically looking for arsenic contamination. The word hit Nate like a physical blow. Arsenic. Someone's been introducing it into the mine's water system. Small amounts over time designed to look like natural mineral contamination. But the pattern is too consistent, too targeted. Nate's mind raced. The miners getting sick. The families moving away. Rose's final illness, which the doctor had said was just a fever, but which had come on so suddenly, so viciously. You're saying someone poisoned the mine. I'm saying someone's been systematically destroying this town one family at a time. The question is why? Eve's eyes met his, and again he caught that flicker of something deeper. Mr. Mackenzie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. All right. Have you ever heard of a place called St. Catherine's Orphanage? The world tilted sideways, St. Catherine's. The gray stone building outside Billings, where he'd spent 5 years of his childhood after his parents died in a wagon accident. The place where scared, broken children had learned to survive by taking care of each other. Where he'd met a little girl with green eyes and auburn hair who'd cried herself to sleep every night until he'd started telling her stories about the adventures they'd have when they grew up. A little girl named Annie Murphy who'd been adopted by a wealthy family from Denver when she was 14, who'd promised to find him someday when they were both old enough to make their own choices. A little girl he'd never forgotten even when life had taken him far from the innocent dreams they'd shared. Annie, the word came out as barely a whisper. Eve's careful composure cracked, revealing raw emotion underneath. Hello, Nate. The 15 years between them collapsed like a house of cards. The shy, determined girl who'd been his anchor during the hardest years of his childhood. The first person who'd ever looked at him like he was worth saving. Jesus Christ, Annie. Nate's legs felt unsteady. Why are you? Because, she said softly, I told you I'd find you someday. And because someone killed your wife, and I'm going to help you prove it. Outside, Moonridge went about its quiet morning business, unaware that everything had just changed. Inside his forge, surrounded by the tools of his careful, controlled life, Nathaniel Mackenzie felt the foundations of everything he'd built start to shift. The woman he'd loved as a child had come back to him as a stranger, and she'd brought with her the one truth he'd never wanted to face. Rose hadn't died of fever. She'd been murdered. End of part 1 from Oman. Would you like me to continue with part 2? 8,000 words of the story. I can see the dramatic momentum is building nicely with the revelation of Eve's true identity and the murder of Rose. The next part will develop their relationship while they investigate the conspiracy leading to more revelations about Gabriel Morrison and the true scope of the threat to Moonridge. The silence that followed Eve's revelations stretched between them like a taut wire ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Nate stared at her, really looked at her, and saw the ghost of the 10-year-old girl who used to trace letters in the dirt while he taught her to read. Annie Murphy. The child who'd made him promise to come back for her, to take her away from the cold dormitories and careful kindness of the nuns. The promise he'd broken when life had pulled him in directions he'd never imagined. You need to sit down, Eve said gently, watching his face go pale. I need to understand. Nate's voice came out rough. Rose. You said someone killed Rose. That's a hell of a thing to say to a man, Annie. It's Eve now, has been for 15 years. She pulled out a chair from his small workbench area. And I know it's a hell of a thing. That's why I spent 2 years making sure before I came here. Nate sank into the chair, his large hands trembling slightly. 2 years. You've been investigating my wife's death for 2 years. I've been investigating a pattern of deaths across mining barns in Montana and Wyoming. Families with young children, and always the mother first, then the father gets desperate and sells his claim cheap. Eve's voice took on the clinical tone of a professional presenting evidence. Always the same symptoms: sudden fever, respiratory distress, death within 48 hours. always blamed on natural causes. That, that's exactly what happened to Rose. I know. Eve pulled out another piece of paper, a list of names, dates, locations. 17 families so far, always in towns with valuable mineral claims, always followed by a mysterious buyer willing to pay cash for worthless mining rights. Nate studied the list, his heart sinking with each name. The Hartwell family in Silver Creek, the Johnsons in Pine Ridge, the Castellanos in Broken Bow. All stories he'd heard in saloons and trading posts. Tragic tales of families destroyed by the harsh realities of frontier life. Except it wasn't harsh reality, it was murder. Who? The word came out like a growl. Who's doing this? That's what I came here to find out. Eve sat across from him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. But I had to start with you because Moonridge is different from the others. How? Because you're here. She leaned forward, intensity radiating from her small frame. Nathaniel Mackenzie, also known as Iron Thunder, the fastest gun in 3 territories, the man who single-handedly broke up the Morrison gang 5 years ago. The name hit him like a physical blow. The Morrison gang. Gabriel Snake Morrison and his crew of murderers and thieves who'd terrorized the territory for years before Nate had tracked them down in a canyon outside Bozeman. It had been his last job as a hired gun. The job that had paid enough for him to settle down, marry Rose, start a family. The job that had ended with 6 dead outlaws and a reputation that followed him like a shadow. You think this is connected to Morrison? I think Gabriel Morrison had a younger brother named Vincent who wasn't with the gang that day. I think Vincent spent 5 years planning his revenge, and I think he's been very, very patient about getting it. Before Nate could respond, the door to his living quarters opened, and Daniel appeared, still wearing his nightshirt, but wide awake and alert in the way that meant he'd been listening. Daniel, Nate started to rise. You should be. She's right, Daniel said quietly, his young voice carrying an authority that stopped both adults cold. About the bad man who's been hurting people. Eve turned to look at the bow, and Nate saw something shift in her expression, a softening, a recognition of kindred spirits, who'd both lost too much too young. What do you know about the bad man, Daniel? Eve asked gently. He came to see Mama, the night she got sick. Daniel moved closer to them, but his eyes stayed fixed on Eve. I saw him through my bedroom window. He looked like the scary stories Mama used to tell about the snake man who ate children's dreams. Nate's blood turned to ice. Daniel, you never told me. You were too sad to hear scary stories. Daniel replied with the devastating honesty of childhood. But she's not too sad. He pointed at Eve. She came here to catch the snake man, didn't you? Eve's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Yes, sweetheart. That's exactly why I came here. Good, Daniel nodded solemnly. Mama would like you. You smell like the workshop, but also like the flowers she used to grow. Iron and lavender, just like he'd said yesterday. Daniel, Eve said carefully, do you remember anything else about the man you saw? What he looked like, what he was wearing? Daniel's forehead creased in concentration. He had a hurt face, like someone drew lines on it with a hot poker. And he walked funny, like his leg didn't work right. Gabriel Morrison had taken a bullet in the thigh during their final confrontation, a wound that would have left him with a permanent limp. And he'd had a distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw, courtesy of a knife fight in his younger days. Jesus, Nate breathed. He's been here. Gabriel Morrison has been in Moonridge. More than that, Eve said grimly. If my research is right, he's been living here, under another name in a position of authority that would let him move freely and gain people's trust. A chill ran down Nate's spine as he considered the possibilities. The town council, the mine foreman, the mayor, he said suddenly. Graham Blackwood. He arrived about 6 months after Rose died, said he was from back east, wanted to help Moonridge recover from our tragic losses. Eve's eyes sharpened, describing tall, dark hair going gray, scar on his face that he says is from a riding accident, walks with a slight limp that he blames on the same accident. Nate felt sick as the pieces fell into place. He's been the one pushing for families to sell their claims. Says it's for the good of the town that we need to consolidate resources. And I'll bet he has a buyer lined up, someone willing to purchase all those worthless claims at rock-bottom prices. Before Nate could answer, they heard hoofbeats outside, multiple horses moving at a pace that suggested urgency. Daniel pressed his face to the window, then turned back with wide eyes. "The snake man's coming," he whispered, "and he brought friends." Eve was already moving, gathering her equipment with the efficient speed of someone who'd planned for this possibility. "Is there a back way out to here?" "Through the mineshaft access tunnel," Nate said, his mind shifting into survival mode. "But Annie Eve, if Gabriel knows you're here, if he suspects what you found, then we're all in danger." She shouldered her bag and looked at him with the same fierce determination he remembered from their childhood. "Nate, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" The knock at the door came before he could answer, polite but insistent, the kind of knock that expected to be answered promptly. "Mr. Mackenzie." The voice was cultured, authoritative, with just a hint of a drawl that Nate now recognized as carefully constructed. "It's Mayor Blackwood. I understand we have a visitor in town who might need some official assistance." Nate looked at Eve, then at Daniel, who had gone very still and pale. His son's instincts had been right from the beginning. Danger had come to Moonridge, and it wore the face of respectability. "Daniel," Eve whispered, "I need you to do something very important for me. Can you be brave?" The boy nodded. "I need you to go to your room and pack a small bag, just the most important things. Then I need you to wait by the back door until your papa or I come to get you. Can you do that while I go?" "What about you and Papa?" "We're going to have a conversation with the mayor. A very careful conversation." Daniel looked between them, the understanding passing across his young features with heartbreaking clarity. "He's the one who hurt Mama." "Yes," Eve said simply, "but we're not going to let him hurt anyone else." The boy disappeared into the back room with the silent efficiency of a child who'd learned that sometimes survival meant being invisible. Nate watched him go, then turned back to Eve with grim determination. "What do you need me to do?" "Follow my lead. Act surprised to see me like we're meeting for the first time. And whatever happens, don't let him know that you know who he really is." The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Mackenzie, I do hope everything is all right in there." Eve took a deep breath, smoothed her hair, and transformed herself into the polite professional mining engineer who'd arrived in town yesterday. The change was so complete that for a moment Nate wondered if he'd imagined the girl from his past. "Ready?" she asked. Nate nodded and opened the door. Graham Blackwood stood on his doorstep, flanked by two men Nate didn't recognize, hired muscle by the look of them, though they wore the clothes of respectable businessmen. The mayor himself was exactly as Nate had described to Eve, tall, distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair and a scar that ran from temple to jaw. Looking at him now, knowing who he really was, Nate couldn't believe he'd never seen the resemblance to Gabriel Morrison. The same cold eyes, the same cruel curve to his mouth when he thought no one was looking. "Mayor Blackwood," Nate said with careful neutrality, "what brings you out so early?" "I understand you have a guest, Mr. Mackenzie, a mining engineer from Denver." Blackwood's gaze moved past Nate to where Eve stood by the workbench, and something flickered in his expression. "I thought it would be neighborly to welcome her to Moonridge personally." "That's very kind," Eve said, stepping forward with a professional smile. "Evelyn Sterling, Territorial Mining Commission." She extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Blackwood took it. Nate watched the man's face carefully, looking for any sign of recognition, but saw only the calculated charm of a politician. "Graham Blackwood, mayor of what's left of this town." His voice carried just the right note of rueful self-deprecation. "Though I'm afraid there's not much left to show a visitor of your caliber." "That's actually why I'm here," Eve replied smoothly. "The commission has received some concerning reports about the mine closure. We want to make sure everything was handled according to territorial safety standards." Of course. Though I'm not sure what more there is to investigate. Tragic accident, but these things happen in mining country." Blackwood's eyes never left her face. "I don't suppose you'd be available for lunch today. I'd be happy to show you the relevant paperwork, introduce you to some of our remaining residents." "That would be wonderful." Watching them talk, Nate felt like he was witnessing a deadly chess match where both players knew the stakes but were still feeling out each other's strategies. Eve was playing her role perfectly, but there was something in Blackwood's manner that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by her performance. "Excellent," Blackwood said. Shall we say noon at the Silver Dollar? Pete Sullivan sets a decent table, and it will give us a chance to discuss Moonridge's unique situation. I look forward to it. After the mayor and his men left, Nate closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. He knows, he said quietly. Maybe not exactly what, but he knows something's wrong. I agree. Eve was already moving, pulling Daniel's bag from where he'd left it by the back door. We need to assume we're being watched now, which means we need to move fast. Move where? The mine. If I'm right about what's been happening here, the evidence is in that mine. And if Gabriel Morrison is planning something bigger than just picking off individual families. She didn't finish the thought, but she didn't need to. Nate understood. If Morrison had been patient enough to spend 4 years building a new identity, if he'd been systematic enough to murder 17 families across 2 territories, then his endgame was going to be devastating. The lunch meeting, Nate said, it's a trap. Of course it is, but it's also an opportunity. Eve's smile was sharp as a blade. Gabriel Morrison spent 5 years planning his revenge on Iron Thunder. What he doesn't know is that Iron Thunder has been planning too. I haven't been Iron Thunder for 6 years, Annie. I'm a blacksmith who makes horseshoes and fixes plows. Maybe, but you're also the man who taught a scared little girl that sometimes the only way to survive is to be smarter and tougher than the people trying to hurt you. She touched his arm gently. I didn't spend 15 years looking for a blacksmith, Nate. I spent 15 years looking for the man who promised to protect the people he loved. Before he could respond, Daniel appeared from the back room with a small bag slung over his shoulder. Are we going on an adventure now? He asked with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who'd learned that life was unpredictable. The biggest one yet, partner, Nate said, kneeling to his son's level. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, Miss Sterling and I are going to keep you safe. I know, Daniel said simply. That's what families do. The word hit Nate like a thunderbolt. Family. This strange, impossible constellation of the woman from his past and the son of his heart and himself, all bound together by circumstances that should have been tragic but somehow felt like destiny. All right then, he said, standing and reaching for the gun belt he hadn't worn in 4 years. Let's go catch ourselves a snake. The entrance to Moonridge's silver mine was a wound in the mountainside, sealed now with timber and warning signs that declared it unsafe for entry. Snow had drifted against the barriers and icicles hung like teeth from the support beams, giving the whole thing the appearance of a mouth frozen in an eternal scream. Eve stood before it with her technical equipment, taking measurements and making notes while Nate and Daniel watched for approaching riders. The plan was simple: get into the mine, gather evidence of the systematic poisoning, and get out before Gabriel Morrison realized they were there. The execution, as always, was going to be more complicated. The main shaft is blocked, Eve said, studying her instruments, but there should be secondary access tunnels. Mining operations this size always have multiple entry points for ventilation and emergency evacuation. There's one about a quarter mile up the mountain, Nate said, mostly used for equipment access. Daniel and I explored it once back when... He trailed off, remembering better days when his son had been curious about everything and the mine had been just another part of their world. That'll work. We just need to be careful about structural integrity. If Morrison's been setting charges to create accidents, the whole system could be unstable. They made their way up the narrow mountain path, Daniel clinging to Nate's hand, while Eve led the way with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd spent years in rough terrain. The secondary entrance was smaller than the main shaft, barely wide enough for a man to walk upright, but the timber supports looked solid. Stay close, Nate warned as they entered the tunnel. And if I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back. Don't ask questions. Just get Daniel to safety. Understood. Eve lit a miner's lamp she'd brought from her equipment bag. But Nate, I didn't come this far to run away. The tunnel angled downward into the heart of the mountain, and soon the winter daylight behind them was nothing more than a distant memory. Their footsteps echoed in the enclosed space, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with metronomic regularity. The main shaft should be about 200 yards ahead, Eve said, consulting what looked like an engineering survey. If my calculations are right, we should intersect it just above the blocked section. They walked in tense silence, listening for any sound that might indicate they weren't alone. Daniel stayed between them, his small hand alternating between Nate's and Eve's as the tunnel demanded single file or allowed them to walk abreast. "Papa," Daniel whispered as they rounded a bend. "Do you smell that?" Nate inhaled deeply and caught at a chemical tang that didn't belong in a natural cave system. Something acrid and dangerous that made his eyes water slightly. "Arsenic compounds," Eve said grimly. "This is where it's been coming from." They emerged into a wider chamber where several tunnels converged, and Eve immediately began setting up her testing equipment. Her lamp cast dancing shadows on the rock walls, and Nate could see dark stains where water had been seeping through the stone. "Look at this," Eve said, holding up a vial of water she'd collected from one of the seepage points. Even in the lamplight, it had a distinctly unnatural color. "This isn't natural mineral contamination. Someone's been introducing arsenic-based compounds directly into the water table." "How?" "Probably through a series of injection points higher up in the system. It would take months of careful work to set up and detailed knowledge of the mine's geology." She moved to another section of the chamber, taking more samples. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Professional job, professional knowledge, amateur execution. "See these drill marks? They're precise, but they were done with standard mining equipment, not specialized injection tools. Someone who understood the theory, but had to improvise the practice." Daniel had been exploring the chamber while they talked, and now he tugged on Nate's sleeve. "Papa, there's light coming from over there." Nate looked where his son was pointing and saw a faint glow emanating from one of the side tunnels, not the steady yellow of another miner's lamp, but the flickering orange of torch or candle flame. "We're not alone," he said quietly. Eve immediately began packing up her equipment, but before she could finish, voices echoed from the tunnel, men talking in low, urgent tones that carried clearly in the still air. "Should have been here hours ago. Said to wait until after the meeting. Don't like leaving the boss alone with that woman." Nate drew his pistol for the first time in 4 years, muscle memory, making the action smooth despite his rusty skills. The weight of it in his hand felt familiar and foreign at the same time. "How many?" Eve whispered. "At least 3, maybe more." Nate positioned himself between his family and the approaching voices. "There's another tunnel behind us. If I can hold them here, you and Daniel can—" "No," Eve's voice was firm. "We stick together. That's what families do, remember." Before Nate could argue, the voices got closer and they could make out individual words. "Boss wants them alive if possible. The woman especially. Says she might have information we need." "What about Mackenzie and the kid?" "Mackenzie's a problem that should have been dealt with 4 years ago. As for the kid," the voice trailed off with an implication that made Nate's blood boil. "This way," he whispered, leading them toward the tunnel Daniel had been exploring. "Quiet as you can." They moved through the mine like ghosts. Eve's lamp shuddered to provide just enough light to avoid obstacles. Behind them, the voices of Morrison's men grew louder as they spread out to search the chamber. The tunnel they'd chosen angled upward, which Nate hoped meant it led to another exit, but after 10 minutes of careful climbing, they hit a dead end, a wall of rock and timber that had been deliberately sealed. "Damn," Eve breathed. "Papa," Daniel whispered, "I can hear them coming." Nate looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped in a dead-end tunnel with armed men between them and freedom. In his Iron Thunder days, he might have shot his way out, but those days were gone and he had his son to think about. "Eve," he said quietly, "I need you to take Daniel and get as far back as you can. When they find us, I'll try to buy you time to know." Daniel stepped away from both adults, his young face set with determination. "I know another way." "Oh, son, there isn't." "Yes, there is." Daniel moved to what looked like a solid rock wall and pressed against a section that seemed no different from any other. To Nate's amazement, the stone shifted slightly, revealing a narrow crack that had been invisible in the lamplight. "I found it when we came exploring before dawn," Daniel explained. "It goes all the way to the outside, but it's too small for grown-ups." Eve knelt beside the opening, shining her light into it. "It's a natural fissure in the rock. Probably connects to a cave system higher up the mountain." She looked at Nate with growing excitement. "I might be able to fit through it, and if I can get outside, I can get help." "Too dangerous. You could get lost or the passage could collapse." "Nate," Eve's voice was gentle but firm. "Trust me, I've been in worse places than this. The sound of boots on stone was getting closer. They were out of time and out of options. "All right," Nate said finally, "but you take this." He pressed his pistol into her hands. "And if something happens to me, you get Daniel out of here and you keep him safe. Nothing's going to happen to you." Eve kissed him quickly, a soft brush of lips that carried 15 years of unspoken love. "Because I didn't come this far to lose you again." She squeezed through the fissure with her equipment bag disappearing into the darkness beyond. A moment later, her voice echoed back faintly. "I'm through. The passage is stable. I'll be back." Nate turned to Daniel, who was watching him with eyes that held too much understanding for a 9-year-old. "You did good, partner. Real good. Will Miss Sterling be okay?" "She's tougher than she looks, just like someone else I know." They settled down to wait, listening to the sounds of search parties moving through the mine below them. Somewhere in the darkness, the woman he had loved as a child was making her way through stone and shadow to bring help. And somewhere else in that same darkness, Gabriel Morrison was discovering that his carefully laid plans were starting to unravel. Nate checked his pocket watch. It was almost noontime for Eve's lunch meeting with the mayor, a meeting she wasn't going to attend, which meant that very soon Gabriel Morrison was going to realize he'd been outmaneuvered by the ghosts of his own past. The game was about to begin in earnest. Eve emerged from the mountain fissure like something born from the stone itself, covered in rock dust and breathing hard from the climb. The exit point was higher up the mountain than she'd expected, giving her a bird's-eye view of Moon Ridge spread out below. From this vantage point, she could see the town's layout, clearly the main street, the forge with its thin column of smoke, the Silver Dollar Saloon where she was supposed to be meeting Gabriel Morrison in 20 minutes. She could also see something that made her blood run cold. Riders, at least a dozen of them positioned at strategic points around the town's perimeter. Not close enough to be obvious to the casual observer, but positioned to cut off all escape routes if something went wrong. Morrison wasn't just planning to capture her and Nate during their lunch meeting, he was planning to trap the entire town. Eve checked Nate's pistol, making sure it was loaded and ready. She'd learned to shoot during her years in Colorado. A mining engineer traveling alone in rough country needed to be prepared for trouble, but she'd never had to use those skills against another human being. Today might be the day that changed. The climb down the mountain face was treacherous, made worse by the need for speed and stealth. Eve picked her way carefully from rock to rock, using mining equipment as improvised climbing gear when the handholds got sparse. She was halfway down when she heard voices below, two men positioned as lookouts on the mountain trail. "Taking too long. Boss said they should have been out by now." "Maybe they got lost in there. Mine's got more tunnels than a rabbit warren." "Or maybe Mackenzie's tougher than we thought. Remember, he's the one who killed Snake Morrison's whole gang. That was 5 years ago. Man gets soft, especially when he's got a kid to think about." Eve crouched behind a boulder, listening to their casual discussion of murder and violence. These weren't local men driven to desperation by hard times. These were professional killers, the kind of men who followed Gabriel Morrison because they enjoyed the work. She waited until they moved farther down the trail, then continued her descent. By the time she reached the outskirts of Moon Ridge, it was 5 minutes past noon, and the Silver Dollar Saloon was visible through the falling snow. The building looked normal from the outside, but Eve could see horses tied behind it, too many horses for a lunch meeting between 3 people. Morrison had brought his entire crew to town, and they were waiting for her to walk into their trap. Instead, she was going to spring one of her own. Eve made her way carefully through the back alleys of Moon Ridge, avoiding the main streets where Morrison's lookouts would be watching. The town felt different now, tense like it was holding its breath before a storm. Mrs. O'Connor's boarding house sat on a side street, and Eve knew the elderly widow would be the perfect ally for what she had in mind. Mary O'Connor had been Rose Mackenzie's closest friend, and she'd never believed the official story about Rose's sudden illness. Eve knocked on the back door, and when it opened, she found herself face to face with a small, fierce woman whose Irish accent had never faded despite 30 years in Montana. "You're the mining engineer," Mrs. O'Connor said without preamble. "The one who's been asking questions about things that should have been asked 4 years ago." "Yes, ma'am, and I need your help." "Come in then before someone sees you standing on my doorstep like a lost lamb." Mrs. O'Connor's kitchen was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the kind of lived-in comfort that spoke of decades of feeding whoever needed feeding. She poured Eve a cup of coffee without asking, then sat across from her at the worn wooden table. You know who killed Rose Mackenzie, she said. It wasn't a question. I know who and I know why, and I know he's planning to kill more people today. Eve wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, grateful for its warmth. Mrs. O'Connor, how many people are left in Moonridge? People you trust, I mean. Depends what kind of trust you're talking about. Trust to keep their mouths shut. Trust to stand up in a fight. Trust to do what's right, even when it's dangerous. All three. Mrs. O'Connor was quiet for a long moment, studying Eve with sharp blue eyes that had seen too much of life to be fooled by appearances. Pete Sullivan at the saloon. He never believed the story about the mine accident. Tom Bradley, who runs the stable, his boy died of the same fever that took Rose. Sarah Chen at the general store, she's got more backbone than any three men. Pastor Hayes, he's young, but he's got sand. And old Joe Hawkins, he used to be a cavalry sergeant before he retired here. That's 6 people plus you and me, against at least a dozen professional gunmen. 7, Mrs. O'Connor corrected. You're forgetting Nate Mackenzie. Nate and Daniel are trapped in the mine with Morrison's men hunting them. Then we best get them out before we worry about anything else. Mrs. O'Connor stood with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd made her decision. I'll gather the others. You figure out how we're going to fight a war with 7 people and whatever weapons we can scrape together. Mrs. O'Connor, Mary, if we're going to die today, we might as well be on a first-name basis. Eve felt a smile tug at her lips, despite the desperate circumstances. Mary, then, and I'm not planning on anyone dying today except the people who deserve it. Good. Rose Mackenzie was like a daughter to me, and that little boy of hers deserves better than growing up an orphan. Mary's expression hardened. Now what do you need me to do? Over the next 20 minutes, Eve outlined her plan, while Mary dispatched messages to the other trusted residents of Moonridge. It was a desperate scheme, full of holes and dependent on timing, luck, and the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. But it was better than sitting back and letting Gabriel Morrison destroy what was left of their community. By 12:30, they were ready. Eve stood at the back entrance to the Silver Dollar Saloon, Nate's pistol in her hand, and her heart pounding with fear and determination. Through the window, she could see Morrison sitting at a corner table checking his pocket watch with growing impatience. He was alone in the main room, but she knew his men were positioned throughout the building, waiting for her to walk through the front door so they could spring their trap. Instead, she was going to walk through the back door and spring hers. Eve took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to whatever deity protected foolish mining and engineers, and stepped inside. Sorry I'm late, she called out cheerfully. I got a bit turned around in all these mountain trails. Morrison looked up sharply, and for just a moment his careful mask slipped. She saw surprise calculation and something that might have been recognition flicker across his features. Miss Sterling, I was beginning to worry something had happened to you. Oh, something has happened, Eve said, walking casually toward his table while keeping her gun hand hidden beneath her coat. But not to me. Gabriel Morrison was a man who'd built his life on reading situations quickly and accurately, but the mining engineer standing in his saloon was presenting him with a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. She should have been nervous walking into what was obviously a trap. She should have been looking around for his men, calculating escape routes, showing some sign of the fear that kept prey animals alive. Instead, Evelyn Sterling seemed almost amused. Please sit, Morrison said, gesturing to the chair across from him, while his mind raced through possibilities. I took the liberty of ordering lunch for both of us. How thoughtful. Eve settled into the chair with the easy confidence of someone who held all the cards in a high-stakes poker game. Though I should mention, I've already eaten, had a fascinating breakfast conversation with some of your employees. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward the gun under his jacket, but he caught himself. My employees, the gentlemen you have positioned in the mine. Very chatty bunch once you get them talking. Eve's smile was sharp as winter sunlight. They told me the most interesting things about arsenic injection systems and systematic property acquisition. Now Morrison understood the source of his unease. This woman wasn't acting like prey because she wasn't prey. She was a predator who'd been stalking him while he thought he was stalking her. I'm not sure what you think you heard, he began. Oh, I'm sure you're not, Eve interrupted. Just like I'm sure you have no idea what happened to your men in the mine about 30 minutes ago. Morrison went very still. What happened to my men? Well, that's an interesting question. What do you think happens when you send armed thugs into an unstable mine system to hunt a man who knows every tunnel and hiding place in the mountain? Eve leaned back in her chair, completely relaxed, especially when that man used to be Iron Thunder. Iron Thunder retired 4 years ago. Iron Thunder took a break 4 years ago. There's a difference. Eve's eyes never left Morrison's face. Tell me, Gabriel. May I call you Gabriel? Did you really think Nathaniel Mackenzie would just lie down and let you murder his family the way you murdered his wife? The use of his real name was like a slap across the face. Morrison's carefully constructed identity as Mayor Blackwood cracked, revealing the cold fury underneath. You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. Actually, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Gabriel Snake Morrison, last surviving member of a gang of murderers and thieves. A man so pathetic that it took him 4 years to work up the courage for a face-to-face confrontation with the person who destroyed his life. Morrison's hand went to his gun, but before he could clear leather, the saloon's front and back doors opened simultaneously. Pete Sullivan stepped through the front entrance with a shotgun in his hands, while Tom Bradley and Joe Hawkins came through the back, both armed and looking like men who'd made their peace with dying today. Now, Eve said mildly, let's keep this civilized. After all, we have so much to discuss. Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, ordinary townspeople who'd been pushed too far and were finally pushing back. His men were nowhere to be seen, and the trap he'd so carefully prepared had become his own cage. Where are my men? He asked again. That depends, Eve said. How important is it to you to know before you die? Where? 20 minutes earlier, Nate had been sitting in the sealed mine tunnel with Daniel, listening to Morrison's search parties get closer when the shooting started. It wasn't the scattered gunfire of a manhunt or the systematic volleys of an execution. It was the sharp, precise exchange of fire between people who knew what they were doing and had every intention of surviving the encounter. That's not Morrison's men shooting at each other, Nate said, rising to peer out of their hiding place. Then who? Daniel whispered. Before Nate could answer, a familiar voice echoed through the mine tunnels. Nate, Daniel, if you can hear me, the cavalry has arrived. It was Eve, but she wasn't alone. Other retry JN continue edit. Other voices joined hers. Pete Sullivan's gravelly baritone, Tom Bradley's Texas drawl, and what sounded like old Joe Hawkins barking orders with the authority of his cavalry days. Stay here, Nate told Daniel, but his son shook his head firmly. We stick together, that's what families do. They made their way carefully through the tunnel system, following the sound of voices and the smell of gunpowder. What they found in the main chamber made Nate's chest swell with fierce pride. The townspeople of Moonridge had come to war. Pete Sullivan crouched behind an overturned minecart, methodically reloading his shotgun while keeping watch on a side tunnel. Tom Bradley had positioned himself to cover the main entrance, his rifle trained on the darkness beyond their circle of lamplight. Joe Hawkins moved between positions with the efficient calm of a man who'd fought in real battles, directing their defense like the sergeant he'd once been. And in the center of it all, Eve knelt beside two wounded men in city clothes, checking their injuries with the clinical efficiency of someone who'd learned field medicine the hard way. Nate, she looked up as he and Daniel emerged from their hiding place, relief flooding her features. Thank God. Are you hurt? We're fine, but how did you... Long story, short version is that your neighbors don't take kindly to people who murder their friends and poison their children. Eve gestured toward the wounded men. These two were happy to tell us where their boss was planning to meet you. Very cooperative once Joe explained the alternatives. Nate looked at the scene with new understanding. This hadn't been a rescue, it had been a rout. Morrison's professional gunmen, used to terrorizing isolated families and intimidating unarmed townspeople, had walked into a carefully planned ambush executed by people fighting for their homes. How many? Nate asked. 8 in the mine, all accounted for, Joe Hawkins reported. 2 dead, 4 wounded, 2 running scared back to Denver if they've got any sense. And Morrison, waiting for you and the silver dollar, thinking he's got the upper hand. Eve's smile was predatory. Mary O'Connor and Sarah Chen are keeping him company while we finish up here. Daniel tugged on Nate's sleeve. Papa is the snake man, really caught... Looks like it, partner. Good. Daniel backed over to one of the wounded gunmen, a man who'd been clutching his shoulder and cursing steadily since they'd arrived. "You're the one who was going to hurt me and Papa." The man looked up at the pair with a mixture of pain and surprise. "Kid, I never—" "Yes, you did. I heard you talking about it." Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact without anger or fear. "But you didn't, so I guess it's okay." The simple forgiveness of a child struck the wounded man like a physical blow. He looked away, unable to meet Daniel's steady gaze. "Come on," Eve said, shouldering her equipment bag. "Time to finish this." They made their way out of the mine in a procession that would have been comical under other circumstances. Two professional gunmen with their hands tied being escorted by a blacksmith, a mining engineer, a 9-year-old boy, a saloon keeper, a stable owner, and a former cavalry sergeant. The snow had stopped falling, and pale afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds as they reached the outskirts of Moonridge. The town looked different, somehow more alive, as if the removal of Morrison's poisonous influence had allowed it to breathe again. "Nate," Eve said quietly as they walked, "there's something you need to know before we face Morrison." "What?" "He's not just after revenge for his brother's death. This whole operation, the poisoning, the property acquisition, the systematic destruction of mining communities, it's bigger than personal vendetta." "How much bigger?" "Railroad big, mining syndicate big. We're talking about a conspiracy that reaches all the way to territorial government." Nate felt his blood chill. "How do you know?" "Because Gabriel Morrison isn't smart enough to plan something like this on his own. He's the front man for people with real money and real power." Eve's expression was grim. "People who won't just disappear because we caught their hired gun." "Then what do? We get Morrison to tell us who's really behind this, and then we make sure the right people hear about it." They reached the Silver Dollar to find a crowd gathered outside every remaining resident of Moonridge, it looked like, along with some faces Nate didn't recognize. Word had spread quickly in the way of small towns, and people had come to see the end of the nightmare that had gripped their community. Mary O'Connor met them at the saloon door, her normally cheerful face set in grim lines. "He's inside," she said quietly. "Been trying to negotiate his way out for the last 10 minutes. Offered Pete $1,000 to let him walk away." "What did Pete say, Whitey? What do you think Pete lost his nephew to the poisoning?" Mary's eyes were hard as flint. "Gabriel Morrison's not walking away from this, Nate. One way or another, justice is getting done today." Nate nodded and pushed through the saloon doors, Daniel's hand firmly clasped in his own. Whatever happened next, his son was going to see it. The boy deserved to witness the moment when the monster who'd killed his mother finally faced the consequences of his actions. The Silver Dollar's main room had been transformed into an impromptu courtroom. Gabriel Morrison sat at the corner table where he'd planned to spring his trap, now surrounded by armed townspeople who'd become his judges and jury. He looked older than Nate remembered from their encounter 5 years ago, grayer, more worn down by years of planning and hatred. But his eyes still held the same cold intelligence that had made him dangerous. "Nathaniel Mackenzie," Morrison said as Nate approached. "Or should I say Iron Thunder? I have to admit, I underestimated you." "You underestimated a lot of things," Nate replied, "starting with the people of Moonridge." Did I accomplish exactly what I set out to do?" Morrison's smile was poisonous. "Your wife is still dead, Mackenzie. Your son still grew up without a mother. You still spent 4 years blaming yourself for something you couldn't have prevented." The words were calculated to wound, and they found their mark. Nate felt the familiar guilt and rage rising in his chest, the same emotions that had driven him to hang up his guns and try to build a peaceful life. But this time he wasn't alone with his pain. "You're right," Eve said, stepping up beside him. "Rose Mackenzie is dead, and nothing can change that. But you made one critical error in your planning, Gabriel." "And what was that?" "You assumed that destroying Nate's family would destroy him. What you didn't count on was that families can be rebuilt, that love can survive even the worst tragedy, that sometimes the people you think you've broken are actually just getting ready to fight back." Morrison's confidence faltered slightly. "Pretty words, Miss Sterling, but they don't change the facts." "Actually, they do," Daniel said, stepping forward with the fearless determination of a child who'd made up his mind about something important. "Because you didn't destroy our family. You just made room for it to get bigger." The boy looked up at Eve with complete trust and acceptance. "Miss Sterling is going to be my new mama, aren't you?" The question caught everyone off guard, including Eve herself. She looked at Daniel, then at Nate, then back at the boy who'd somehow seen straight to the heart of what they'd all been dancing around. "If your papa thinks that's a good idea," she said carefully. "Papa," Daniel turned to Nate with the same directness. "Do you want Miss Sterling to be part of our family?" The saloon had gone completely silent. Every person in the room was watching this intimate moment play out in the most public possible venue. Under normal circumstances, Nate would have been mortified by the attention. But these weren't normal circumstances. And sometimes the most important questions got asked at the strangest times. "Yes," Nate said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. "I think that's exactly what I want." Eve's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. "Then yes, Daniel, I would be honored to be part of your family." Morrison's face contorted with fury. "How touching. A family reunion built on the grave of the woman I killed." The casual admission of murder sent a ripple of anger through the crowd, but Nate held up his hand for quiet. "Why here, sir?" he asked simply. "Why Rose? Why all those families? Gabriel, your brother, was a killer and a thief who got exactly what he deserved. Why destroy innocent people for his sake?" "Because I could—" Morrison snarled, his careful facade finally cracking completely. "Because you took everything from me, and I wanted you to know what that felt like. Because watching you suffer was the only thing that made me feel alive again. And the others, the Hartwells, the Johnsons, all those families." "Practice," Morrison said with a shrug that chilled everyone in the room. "And profit. Amazing how much people will pay for mineral rights after a few tragic accidents convince the current owners to sell cheap." "Who?" Eve demanded. "Who was paying you?" Morrison looked at her for a long moment, calculation warring with spite in his expression. Finally, spite won. "Continental Mining Syndicate," he said, "backed by railroad money and territorial politicians who know which way the wind's blowing. You think catching me stops anything? I'm just the hired help, little girl. The real power behind this operation will find someone else to do their dirty work." "Maybe," Eve agreed, "but they'll have to do it without you." She pulled a folded document from her coat pocket, official-looking papers with territorial seals and legal language. "Warrant for your arrest signed by the territorial marshal in Helena," she said. "Seems someone's been gathering evidence about systematic mining claim fraud across Montana and Wyoming. Amazing what you can accomplish when you have friends in the right places." Morrison stared at the warrant with dawning comprehension. "You're not just a mining engineer. I'm a mining engineer working with the Territorial Attorney General's office to investigate mineral rights fraud. Has been my real job for the last 2 years." Eve's smile was professionally satisfied. "The engineering degree is real, but the mission was always to gather evidence against operations like yours. You've been hunting us. I've been hunting the people who killed my family." Eve's voice went soft and deadly. "Because Rose Mackenzie wasn't the only innocent woman who died for your employer's profit. And Nathaniel Mackenzie isn't the only man who deserved justice." Morrison looked around the room at the faces surrounding him. Ordinary people who'd been pushed beyond their breaking point, law officers who'd finally caught up with him, and the man whose life he'd spent 4 years trying to destroy, standing strong with his new family beside him. "This isn't over," he said desperately. "Even if you arrest me, even if I testify against Continental Mining, there are others. The corruption goes deeper than you know." "Maybe," Nate said quietly, "but that's not our problem anymore." He knelt beside Daniel, putting his hands on his son's shoulders. "What do you think, partner, is justice done?" Daniel studied Morrison with the serious attention he brought to all important decisions. Finally, he nodded. "The snake man can't hurt anyone anymore," he said with satisfaction. "And Mama can rest now." 2 hours later, Gabriel Morrison was on his way to Helena in the custody of territorial marshals, accompanied by a stack of evidence that would likely bring down one of the largest mining fraud operations in the American West. The people of Moonridge gathered in the Silver Dollar for an impromptu celebration that felt more like a wake, not for the dead, but for the fear that had gripped their community for so long. Nate stood at the bar with Eve beside him and Daniel on his shoulders, watching their neighbors laugh and talk with an ease that hadn't been seen in years. Pete Sullivan was buying drinks for anyone who wanted them. Mary O'Connor was organizing a feast from whatever food could be found, and Joe Hawkins was regaling a group of wide-eyed children with stories of the Battle of Moonridge Mine. So what happens now? Nate asked. Now we rebuild, Eve said simply. The mine can be cleaned and reopened safely. The families who left might come back when word gets out that it's safe. Continental Mining's claims will be voided when they're convicted of fraud. And us, Eve's smile was soft and full of promise. We have a wedding to plan, a town to help rebuild, and a family to figure out. Don't forget the new baby, Daniel said from his perch on Nate's shoulders. Both adults looked at him in surprise. What new baby? Nate asked. The one Miss Sterling's going to have, Daniel said matter-of-factly. I dreamed about her last night. She's going to have dark hair like Mama and green eyes like Miss Sterling, and she's going to be really good at fixing things. Eve blushed furiously. Daniel, that's not exactly how... How do you know it's going to be a she? Nate interrupted, grinning. Because I asked for a sister, Daniel replied with the logic of childhood. And I've been very good this year. Nate and Aunt Eve looked at each other over the boy's head, both thinking the same thing after everything they'd been through, after all the loss and pain and fear. Maybe it was time to believe in the possibility of new beginnings. Well, Nate said finally, I guess we better get started then. As the celebration continued around them, the family that had been forged in the crucible of Moonridge's darkest hour stood together looking toward a future that suddenly seemed full of hope. Outside, snow began falling again, but inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, surrounded by friends and neighbors, and the promise of better days ahead, it felt like spring. The ghost of Iron Thunder had finally been laid to rest. In its place stood Nathaniel Mackenzie, blacksmith, father, husband-to-be, and guardian of a community that had learned the true meaning of family. And in the mountains above Moonridge, the silver mine waited to be reborn, its poisoned waters running clean at last.